available on the council's website. Working days. Councillor, probably going to get a message from you that the injury is going to phone up a school. Okay, but I'm not looking into that then, and obviously we'll get that rectified. Thanks for letting us know. Okay. So with that, just a couple of housekeeping items. Obviously, councillors Watson and people are late due to the heavy traffic on the network. So hopefully that as soon as possible. Given looking at some of the speaker statements, Councillor Barry Johnson's not here this evening, but he has put in a statement, so we will read that out or read that statements. And outside that, I have had a email from, I think it was the land of Fen Lane, which I think we might be 21st. There was a request from the developer to do a site visit prior to the meeting. I mean, it's not something we usually do, but I say just keep an eye on your emails, and if that comes to fruition, we'll try and put something in. But if not, just as it was your request. So yeah, just keep an eye. I'm not sure. All right, then. So with that, it's happy. We'll get this underway. First off, apologies for absence. Hannah?
Thank you, Chair. I haven't received any apologies.
No, I think everyone has been found. All right, then, moving on to minutes found on pages 5 to 12. Any comments on the accuracy of minutes? I'd be happy to approve. Yeah, okay, fantastic. And with our items of urgent business, they're so, and then we're moving on to declarations of interest. Coming after declarations of interest, to declarations of correspondence on the next item. So we move on to declarations. Sorry, Councillor Howland.
Yeah. Education, outlined that change.
And to declarations of receipt of any correspondence. Now, I don't believe received. Okay. Right, so with that, we can move on to 6. So we only have 2 items on the agenda this evening, but as mentioned, we do have 2 meetings this month. I understand we've got some items coming on first. We've got some quite large ones, so yeah, hopefully that will ease the pressure on that meeting. Right then, so with that, we go to item 7, which is the first item on the agenda this evening. This is 22/00101/CB Domesgate Farm, down on pages 13 to 32. And Matthew, I understand you'll be presenting the report. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Bit of housekeeping for you. We've had one late letter from a neighbouring property. It refers to one of the historic applications to on this particular site, but it does raise some points about the current application, and it makes the point that garages weren't envisaged in the original planning application. It points out that Thurrock Farm, which is close to the site, is a listed building, so it's a heritage asset. It makes the point that at the time of writing, which was this week, they'll look at it, 4 of the 5 houses were under construction, and when viewed from a distance, the neighbour is saying there doesn't appear to be much space between the houses. The letter refers to openness and considers that the proposal will take away from openness, which is obviously a greenbelt matter, and one of the defining points about the greenbelt. Refers to a previous application which was refused for garages, which is set out in the history section of the report. Makes the point about mezzanine, which has been referred to by the applicant, and mezzanine floor space in a now demolished building, makes the point about whether or not that can actually be counted at this stage in the proceedings, and finally makes the point about the urbanising effect of the development. Now, I don't know whether or not that refers to the existing development, i.e. the approved development or what's been proposed, but it's just a point about urbanisation. So, I think Ken is going to run through the presentation because I haven't sussed out the IT yet. So there we go. So if we just walk through the presentation, so it's an application under section 73 of the Planning Act. That basically means there was a previous planning commission, and this application seeks to vary conditions attached to that permission, and it's the conditions which relate to approved plans, and it seeks to introduce 5 garages. So it's 5 plots which have been approved and which are under construction. They don't have garages. This application seeks to amend the condition to vary the plans to add garages, 1 garage per plot. Next, please. So that's an area. It's on the southern side of Dusgate. So Dusgate is running basically left to right across the centre of the screen, and you've got Lower Dunton Road off on the right hand side. So it's outlined in red, rectangular shaped site. That's what was on the site previously, which was a range of agricultural / horticultural type buildings, barn, etc., which have now been demolished. I think there's another area on the next slide. Thank you. Yeah, so that's an oblique aerial photograph showing what was there. Rural type buildings, let's just put it that way, which have now been demolished. So in terms of history, next slide please. So what was approved, I think it was last year, but it was a 2020 reference, was replacement of those structures with 5 detached dwelling houses. On the screen there, on the dotted line, that's the sort of footprint of what was there. So there were 3 buildings. It was replaced with 5, and you can make out the access and arrangement of car parking and gardens, etc., etc. Now, the consideration at the time, because the site is in the greenbelt, was the relative effects of what's there, or the relative impacts of what was there and what was being proposed. And there's a test within national policy which applies. So the actual test, and I will refer to it, is quite important, says that buildings, which starts off from the position that buildings are inappropriate, full stop, but there are certain exceptions to that. So paragraph 149G, sorry to get technical with you, says that limited infilling or partial redevelopment of previously developed lands, whether redundant or in continuing use, could be appropriate, provided that, and this is the key sentence, it would not have a greater impact on the openness of the green belt than the existing development. So the judgment between what was there, what's being proposed, would it have a greater impact? That was found acceptable because the footprint of development and the volume of development was no greater than the previous buildings on the site. So that's what's been approved. Next slide, please. What's been proposed are 5 garages, which are the rectangles you can make out sort of beigey colour next to each plot. I think there's a couple of photos. Sorry, that's it. They are what they are. They are garages with pitch roofs. I've just wait to finish your notes. And there's a couple of photographs, I think. So that's a fairly recent site. That's Google Images, actually. So the former buildings have gone. You can make out a hoarding around the site. Obviously, the site's in the green belt, so you can make out open fields beyond. Next, please. That's taken from inside the site, so looking north, basically, towards Dusgate Lane, so you can make out the slab of one of the new plots. And I think there's one more, so that's taken more recently, last month or the month before, looking into the site. And there's some scaffolding going up, so they're probably coming out of the ground. So the judgment is, in terms of greenbelt, is it appropriate development? So officers have formed the view that because it goes beyond the footprint, in particular of what was previously there, it has to be defined as inappropriate development. There's not a lot of latitude for that. So it being inappropriate development, it's by definition harmful. That's what the NPPF says. That's what national policy says. And you have to put substantial weight on inappropriate development. So it's the argument which you will be familiar with. If it's inappropriate development, it's harmful. Is there harm to openness? Yes, you put new buildings in the green belt, it harms openness. And you can argue about the relative degree of impact on openness, but de facto it harms openness because the defining characteristics of the green belt, again as defined in national policy, are its permanence and its openness. So then it's a judgment about are there very special circumstances, or are there considerations which would outweigh the harm, which would then mean that very special circumstances exist to approve the development and take a decision contrary to national policy and indeed local policy as well in the core strategy. Now, the applicant hasn't particularly put forward a case for very special circumstances. What they have done is referred to a mezzanine, so that's a floor, if you like, in between floors, which would have been on the rectangular building on the northern part of the site. Now, that building's clearly been demolished, so we can't actually verify whether or not it was there. An officer would take the view that you can't really retrospectively rely on an argument about a mezzanine floor if you weren't relying on that argument at the time when the application was first considered last year. It's also the case that Greenbelt, in terms of impact on openness, it's an exterior. If you think about the metrics of it, it's really the external impact which we're looking at. So the footprint and the volume. It's not so much about floor space. It's about how the buildings appear visually from the outside. So the reliance on the mezzanine, we don't think cuts much weight, shall we say. And as I said, the building's gone and you can't really retrospectively rely on that. That's the sum of the argument, basically, in terms of Greenbelt. So it is inappropriate development. Definition, it's harmful. Are there factors which would outweigh that harm so that very special circumstances exist? We don't think so. So you are pushed in the policy sense towards a refusal, hence the recommendation. We've also referred to a second reason for refusal, which was attached to the previous refusal, which was under delegated powers, about the urbanising effect. Now, this is a bit more esoteric as an argument, if you like. So if you have former agricultural buildings or barns or whatever it is, and they get removed and replaced by, let's say, a residential development, you can look at the metrics of it, you can look at footprint, you can look at volume. But it's also a character type argument, because the relative impacts of an agricultural building, which perhaps you'd expect to see in a rural location, and a small housing estate are completely different. And indeed, there are appeal decisions I've seen where an inspector has said, even though in terms of replacement, the developer is looking to put back less, that the relative impact in terms of character of a residential property with fences, with outbuildings, with domestic paraphernalia would be a different type of impact in terms of character than a rural building. So the second reason for refusal is more about rural character and an urbanising impact, which the additional garages would add to the development. So that's the recommendation before you. Happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you. Spare me 1 second. You happy to participate? Yeah, thank you. Okay, thank you. Councillor Watson, just back out of the offices as you can see it for the poll. Participate. Okay. We have but obviously having a circumstance where that's the end. Thank you. Okay, right. So here we go. This opens it up to questions. There's a few hands raised. Let's go. Steve Taylor. Matt, when we look at the demographic of bird's eye view, Ken, maybe if you could go back a few slides. Obviously, there is an emphasis here that it's a Greenbelt application, and if you go back it's a group application, and what we have here is developer. They're building these homes, and it looks like from one of the statements they've gone out to the market and they've said, look, realistically, if you've got these homes in this area, it's definitely viable to have a garage due to the size of the garden, storage space, etc. So for me, now we're looking at that slide there. Now, Ken, if you could so kind as to move forward one slide. For me, the impact of those garages, I think the argument against building this in the Greenbelt was probably on the basis of the original application. So that was approved by officers. And now what we're looking at is an alteration. So it'll be interesting to see what other members think. Steve, it'll be interesting to see, Mr. Taylor, to see what you think on the basis of your background on Greenbelt. For me, it just seems very heavy at this stage to now turn around and say the previous fly is acceptable, but that there, it's almost like, in a way, you're saying, oh, that's the straw that broke the camel's back. So what would you say to that, Matt? I know planning's a broad church, I know it's difficult, but for me, it just seems very heavy to suggest that those garages are what tip the balance in terms of what is and what is not acceptable on Greenbelt. Matt, if you could...
Yeah, Chair, I think you're right in terms of what they are, i.e. they're 4-bedroom detached properties in a rural location, and how they'll be marketed, because they'll probably be marketed as, you know, Malvern Upland stuff, which I do have a problem with because of Uplands is a London borough, quite some distance away. I live in Haven, so they'll be marketed as a prestige, if you want to put it in those terms. And to be honest with you, I was quite surprised when the application came in. I didn't deal with it, but I signed off the case. There we are. Put my hand up. I signed off that case. I was quite surprised that garages weren't proposed, because if you were spending probably a considerable amount of money for a 4-bedroom detached in that sort of location, maybe you'd expect a garage. I mean, there is a more than sufficient supply of car parking there. I think each plot, because there's in tandem spaces, there's probably at least 4 spaces in each plot. Plus visitor spaces on the right hand side there. So you haven't got an argument about shortfall of car parking here. And you would need a car because it's a rural location. You know, there are no footpaths, no bus service. So you need a car. So it's perhaps surprising that the original application didn't include garages. I'm being careful what I'm saying here because I think the applicant's in the room. So perhaps that might have been an oversight to put it that way. But the issue before you is a matter of principle. And I know the point you're making about, well, actually, if you look at one drawing, you look at the next drawing, and certainly a small change, it's a small incremental change, but it comes back to the principle of, is it, the steps you have to go through. Is it appropriate? Yes, no. And then you look at harm, and if it is inappropriate, which we're satisfied it is inappropriate, then there's a clear step. Clear steps which have to be gone through, which have been battered out by the High Court and all the rest of it. You have to look at harm. You have to put substantial weight on the harm. That's the policy test. And you have to consider whether or not there are factors which clearly outweigh that harm. So it's a matter of principle, in that, if you like, the allowance, the footprint allowance, the volume allowance for replacement was used up first time. Now, it would be difficult potentially if the dwellings are coming out the ground for the developer to retrofit, to make the dwelling smaller so they can then free up volume and footprint to use for garages. But putting it bluntly, that's not the problem of the local planning authority. We considered what was in front of us at the time. Yes, we did raise an eyebrow. There are no garages. They now want to retrofit garages. In principle, it's inappropriate development.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Okay, there's a few hands raised. I'm going to go to Councillor Howden, then Steve Taylor, and then Councillor Byrne. I think your hand was raised as well. I'm after questions. I'll debate, yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
Councillor Howden.
Thanks, Councillor Kelly. 2 questions. Matt, is this probably, in terms of officer judgment, would you say that this is probably one of the more heavily subjective ones? Because one of the phrases that you use is weight of harm. And looking at the application in terms of rating of the judgments, if there were 5 4-bedroom houses there, I don't think I'd look at what a magnificent open vista. Suddenly there are garages there, I would suddenly change my mind and say what a jungle. But if the homes are already there, the homes have planning permission to build, the addition of garages seems like a very, very minor tweak. You know, depriving this application of the garages wouldn't suddenly make this a massive, vast open greenbelt site. So would you say that the recommendation for refusal is probably one of the more subjective ones?
You're to do both or?
Oh, yeah. The second question was that I understand that as a part of the original application, permissive development rights were moved. So there's no ability to create storage just off their own backs. With hindsight, is it particularly wise to take away permissive development rights when we pass these applications? Because in my mind, the placement of garages for homes really quite a minor thing to do. So it just strikes me as strange that we remove permissive development rights ability to create storage. And that's quite a minor thing. So in hindsight, have we just made this whole process a bit too cumbersome? Because, you know, I quite agree with you. 4-bedroom houses, I typically would expect garages perhaps come with them. So with the passage of the application, wouldn't we just take it as indicative that they may develop garages at some stage as a minor tweak to the bulk of the application?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. It's not a subjective judgment. I think I made, in terms of the principle, it's inappropriate development. That we're satisfied with that because the test is that buildings are inappropriate development unless they meet the limited number of exceptions, and that goes back to the point I made about paragraph 149G and not having a greater impact on the openness of the greenbelt with the existing development. How a planning inspector and how this local planning authority and every other planning authority judge whether or not development has a greater impact than what was previously there is to look at the metrics in the first instance, to look at the footprint of what was there, to look at the extent of hard standings, how buildings are placed around a site, and the volume. That's your starting point. If putting it bluntly, an applicant who wants to redevelop previously developed land in Greenbelt basically gets one bite of the cherry. They get to do their survey of what's there and the footprint and the volume, and then usually they try and max out in terms of replacement. Now, again, putting it bluntly, the application which was approved in last year maxed out. In terms of the footprint and the volume and hard stands, it maxed out. Now they're looking for a bit more. Now, I understand we go back to a point of principle in the Greenbelt, and that's not really open to interpretation. It's either appropriate or it's not. And because they've maxed out and gone beyond the metrics, so it's certainly not a subjective judgment in terms of whether or not it's appropriate or inappropriate. It's inappropriate. The judgment perhaps for you then is you are entitled to place different weight on the factors promoted in favour of an application, fine. But you can't really argue about whether or not it's appropriate or inappropriate. It's quite clear from national policy and your own policy in the core strategy about what's appropriate and inappropriate. The next stage on from that, you can take a view about relative impact and whether or not there are factors clearly outweighing the harm. But you have to, as a starting point, you have to put substantial weight, that's the policy test, on the harm. Going on from there is a judgment. Oh, sorry, PD rights. That's the second question.
Yeah. I understand the point you're making about the principle, and I would understand the argument if this application was simply for a cluster of garages in the middle of Virgin Greenbelt, but this application is for garages sited alongside brand new, already improved houses. So in terms of, if the principle was the policy protects Greenbelt from a massive incursion, I can understand it. But surely looking at this application, we're talking about garages being co-located with existing approved development. So I'm not clear how the principle of all development in Greenbelt is necessarily harmful applies to a situation where we're not talking about open virgin Greenbelt, we're talking about co-location with development. So I'm not sure I understand how the principle applies.
Yeah, Chair, we are talking about previously developed lands, but it is in the Greenbelt. It's not clearly there were buildings on the site, but the fact is, if you looked at the local plan notation, the site is in the Greenbelt. I think that the point, and I'm not putting words in mouth, the point you're getting at is about the the relative impact of a new development as opposed to an existing approved development adding bits on. Quoting directly from the paragraph of national policy, new buildings, local planning authorities should regard the construction of new buildings, and they are clearly new buildings, as inappropriate. The exceptions to this are A, B, C, D, E, F, G. We're talking about G. And then we're talking about should not have a greater impact on the openness of the Greenbelt than existing developments. You have to go back to the first development which was there. And again, we've run the metrics, we've looked at the footprint, we've looked at the volume. The 2021 approval maxed out. Okay, so anything beyond that, i.e. 5 garages, I know the point you're making, it's only 5 garages potentially, but it's 5 garages beyond what's been approved as a maximum. So de facto, it has to be inappropriate development. That I would suggest is the starting point. You can discuss, whether or not you think it would be significantly harmful to openness, or you can discuss whether or not you think there are factors clearly outweighing that harm. But the starting point, it's inappropriate. I don't think you can escape from that. And that is a matter of principle. New buildings, it doesn't say, that's not qualified by X thousand square metres or X height. New buildings, any new building. So that's a point of principle, because I repeat myself. Defining Greenbelt is a long established government policy over decades. I think probably going back prior to the Second World War. Successive governments have put great importance on the Greenbelt and the defining characteristics of the Greenbelt, which repeat again and again. Their permanence and their openness. So if you put a new building in the Greenbelt, any new building, it impacts on openness. But you can have a judgment about how relative that impact is. But in terms of principle, a new building, it doesn't meet those tests, and we've gone beyond those tests, it's harmful. That's your starting point.
I interrupted you when you started.
Yes, sorry, I've gone. I'll go back. Right. Yes, I think I haven't got the decision in front of me, and I'll take 5 minutes trying to find it, but it's highly likely you would have taken my permitted development rights, because permitted development rights for dwelling houses are fairly extensive, and that's where they've been tweaked and extended. So we have less and less control as a planning authority. And if you wanted when I first started doing this job, you couldn't really do a lot to your house. Now you can really hack off your neighbours if you want to, without going anywhere near a planning application. So we did take away permitted development allowances, partly because they've maxed out on the volume and the footprint, and partly because it's Greenbelt and it's about openness. So we have control. It doesn't mean to say you can't make an application, but we have control. Taking away PED basically means you have to make an application. So we can take a view about whether or not it's acceptable or not. It doesn't mean thou shall never extend the property or build an outbuilding. It means we just have control over it through the submission of a planning application.
Okay, thank you. And just very quickly, Matt, just whilst we're around the area of volume and footprint, on the last application you suggested, the one that was approved, that they pretty much maxed out the footprint, and that's relatively correct, because it's quite similar. What's that? 1,025 under the stables, etc., and then we're looking at 1,023. Then when you take the volume into account, it's significantly less. And even the new one is significantly less. So what's that? 3,983 volume. This is on page 122, by the way. And then on the original, which was over 4,000. So in the sense of the volume, they're probably not maxed out. Am I getting that right, or what's the thought process around that? The footprint's more important than the volume, etc.
Well, yeah, I think they're all important. Yeah, I mean, okay, volume. The previous buildings were larger format agricultural type buildings, which again, I'll go back to the point. In a rural location, you'd probably expect to see them. You know, if you drive around the borough, if you drive around any rural part of anywhere in the country, you'll see barns, you'll see hay stores, you'll see stable blocks, you'll see. I mean, I remember one in Havering, there was an abattoir. You know, and you can argue about the relative beauty of those buildings, but you almost expect to see them. So they were taller buildings. So yes, there were more volume. But in terms of the spread of buildings, I mean, it's up on the screen in front of you, and hard standings. That's equally as important as volume.
Yeah. Because I suppose from my perspective, I get where you're coming from. I know Canning's a full church, but ultimately what we're saying there is it's acceptable to see barns in a rural location. It's acceptable to see 5 large homes in a location, but 5 large homes with garages, it's a tough sell for me to suggest that that's the problem. But let's see where what other people think. I've got a list of names. Right, sorry, Councillor Piccolo.
Yeah, I'm really.
No, we understand the network's really jammed. So, but thank you for making it, and obviously we're going into the agreeing station after this application. So, thank you for making it. All right then. So I've got a list of names here. I'm going to go to Steve, and then Steve Taylor, and then we've got Councillors Polly and Bob.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, thank you, Matt. Quite a lot of what I was has been covered. I suppose I can sum it up really simply so that it doesn't drag on forever.
Sorry. I was on. Sorry.
Well, it says it's starting. Whatever that means. There you go. Is that better? As if you couldn't hear me. So as I say, I'm not, depending on what I'm going to say in debate, but it's a straightforward question which might clarify some of the regulation around the Greenbelt Road. If the application had come in like that originally, it would have exceeded the footprint, which is how it's normally measured, of the existing buildings. Would that have then been refused?
Yeah, it would have been contrary to policy. Yeah. So unless the applicant was promoting considerations to clearly outweigh harm, such that very special circumstances exist, then the presumption would be it's a refusal.
Yeah. So my question really was, it would have been refused like that simply because, so to sort of, it's almost disingenuous to sort of add that when it's too late to amend the original. But that's just So that was my point. It wouldn't have been passed had it looked like a year ago.
Yeah, we'd have had a negotiation with the applicant and advise them to take
manage the footprint.
To take it back down. Yeah.
No, that's fine. Thanks, Matt.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to Councillor Polly and Councillor Byrne.
Thank you, Chair. Just on that point, can I just ask for some clarification? As long as I'm speaking West Matt, that we don't say the footprint as if we're looking at volume over footprint, whereas the conversation with Stephen you have just had is about over footprint. And I really would like that cleared up.
It's about both, to put it simply. You have to, I mean, all you've got in terms of national policy is not have a greater impact on openness. So how do you make that judgment? Or their buildings. So you think about their dimensions and you think about their siting and how they're arranged on over the land. So you could get one big building existing on a Greenbelt site, and somebody wants to replace a build, they want to scattergun all over the place. Well, you could take the view, actually that's less footprint, less volume, but they're putting it all over the place. So the relative impact on openness is greater. So it is judgment, but it would, in my view, and it's based on the externals, how you would see it, which is the point about the mezzanine I made. It's not so much about the floor space. Now, within the building, you could have a floor. What do you see from the outside? you see the envelope of the building. So it's the height, the volume, and the footprint, the physical space it takes. So it's sort of in answer to your question. Yeah, we've talked about footprint. We haven't talked much about volume because, strictly speaking, yeah, the chair's right on page 22. We've given that that table, and in terms of what was there originally, because they were taller buildings, it's probably a reduction in volume. That's only part of the argument. It's about footprint as well. Does that answer it, or are you more confused?
No. So if those garages are capable garages, they would be separate buildings.
If they would come through as integral, so if the original application for 5 detached and would have had design as integral, again we would have looked at the metrics, would have looked at the footprint of each property, and would have looked at the volume, etc. Now, on volume, this development's fine. It's the footprint where we have an issue. So I think in the report, it would be difficult for the applicant now to retrofit, if you like, to change the foundations and the footprint of the units to incorporate an integral garage, so that they're not maxing out on the footprint. Which is go back to the point I was saying about, perhaps it was a little bit surprising the first time around they didn't include garages, but it's the point of principle here. They are new buildings and they would have a greater impact on the calculations we've done than what was there previously. So that's where we are as a starting point. But you're a planning committee and you deal with plenty of greenbelt applications, and you'll need to take a view about the factors in support of an application and balance those against the harm.
The comment about the wasn't there a mezzanine floor on the building that had been been removed before. I mean, that is an argument. We can no more disprove that there was a mezzanine floor than prove there is. And I would just suggest that any agricultural building had a mezzanine. Just knowing the nature of agricultural workers and the way that these buildings are used. I mean, in one of the letters that I've read through, the suggestion that there's been a site inspection by one of our wildlife. So, is that what it hinges on? That is it? If there was a mezzanine floor, these garages could be allowed, and if there wasn't, they can't.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. There are mezzanine floors and there are mezzanine floors. So within a warehouse building, you would get floors in between floor plates where people can stand and work and move around. And indeed, so, for instance, at London Gateway on the logistics park, we've got a definition within the local development order of what a mezzanine floor is, because that's meaningful floor space where people can work, but it's in between a ground floor and a first floor, which would potentially cover the whole of the floor plate. So it's like half floors or quarter floors. So the reference to a mezzanine floor, well, I think there might have been survey. I'm going from memory here, so take this a little bit anecdotally. There might have been survey drawings suggesting quote a mezzanine. But I think within the application, it was referred to as unsafe, which begs the question: was it usable floor space? And it's gone. The fact remains, the building's gone. And without, if that argument should be made first time round. You know, if an applicant through their agent is arguing there was a mezzanine, this is floor space, this should go into the metrics and the calculation. That should be made first time round. It's difficult, I think, to then argue further down the track, once a building's been demolished and we can't verify that, oh, actually, no, there was a mezzanine floor and we should put that into the calculation. The inspection, I suspect, was done by the council's ecologist, because for those sorts of buildings, you could get bats. So I suspect he went on site, stuck a torch up there and had a look to see whether or not there's any evidence, you know, bat droppings or whatever. So that was the inspection. Certainly as officers, we've never, yeah, or whatever else you get, anything potentially. As officers, we've never been on site and made that detailed inspection. No.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Right, let's go to Councillor Byrne.
Yeah, first time I think here I've agreed with.
Councillor Byrne.
Yeah, anyway.
So long with that.
I take it these garages are building are not free, they don't go up for like no cost. So nicking a bit of greenbelt would make these houses more profitable to the contractor maybe. And you can't answer that, I know, but that's a problem. Is it like a little game to make more money and nicking a bit of greenbelt?
I could possibly answer that question. There would be a build cost, and there would be a cost.
So
there'd be a marketing exercise.
Garages would have to be sold at a price. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Watson.
Thank you. Can I just clarify something? We're talking about the greenbelt here. The greenbelt's lost all this. If we were doing the greenbelt, why did we build it in the beginning? We're already building 5. So, at where the garage is going to be, if the garage wasn't there, is that just asphalt parking? So we've lost that part of the greenbelt anyway, because it's tarmac built. It's already gone over the tarmac. So I'm slightly struggling to see why there's a massive problem on the garage when you've already agreed 5 4-bed houses. So Matt, can you just sort of like,
Yeah, just to sort of back.
enlighten us on this part? Because if we didn't build that garage and somebody decided to get a bankable garage, which could put it there, what does that mean? Does that mean that's harmful to rebuild, or does that do we can tend to take it down?
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I think one of the arguments Matt's using is the footprint that's causing the concern. By building the garages, the footprint increases. That's one of his main arguments. But in terms of what you're saying, the mountable, yes, and we had applications last month of large structures in the back garden, which are used really. So yeah, Matt, the mountables, obviously would they be able to build these sorts of these big demountable homes that we're seeing in people's back gardens without any permission?
Yeah, so go back to the first point of the question, which is, you know, what it was. Well, we've already approved 5 dwellings. That was found to be acceptable in green policy terms, because you can replace existing buildings, and clearly part of the site is previously developed land. There are buildings on the site. You know, there was an area of hard standing. So your own policies in the core strategy and the MPPF is quite clear. You can replace them, limited infilling or partial complete development of previously land, provided that the new buildings wouldn't have a greater impact. So there were buildings, they had an impact, made an assessment about the relative impact existing proposed, and we concluded there was no greater impact. That's appropriate in the Greenbelt. That's approvable. These are new buildings, and I take yes, they would be sited on existing areas of hard standing, I think, which is what approved. So you'd lose a surface space for a covered space, but on a very simple level, they are new buildings. Yeah, there's no argument for that. They're meant as permanent buildings. You know, they would be constructed by a builder. They wouldn't just be thrown up. So we have to go to the MPPF again about new buildings, they are inappropriate unless those circumstances apply, and that's where we get to the metrics and all the rest of it. So that's why we approve what was there, the slide before you, without the garages, because the judgment about what was there previously and what was proposed last year, no greater impact. We're going beyond that. There is a greater impact because there's more footprint of build development. Yeah, if you take away the buildings, those garages, you're still left with the footprint. You're still left with the hard standing area where you could park a car. But I'd argue, visually, if you're outside the site and you were looking in, there's a difference between looking at a car which would come and go and looking at a permanent garage. That's a judgment for you. But in terms of new buildings, it's a new building. You can't escape that, and it is inappropriate. As I said, where you go from there is up to you because you're the decision-making committee on this one. But you can't escape that as a point. About demountables, and I wasn't at the last committee, so you'll have to, I might be winging this a little bit. I shouldn't be saying that, but I might be winging it a little bit. We've taken away permitted development allowances. I would imagine, off the top of my head, and I'm looking across at Lee because he's probably just as familiar with me, we would have taken away permitted development allowances for extensions to the building. So if you want a rear extension, side extension, whatever it is, we probably would have taken away permitted development of things like porches, dormer windows, and I'm assuming outbuildings, which could include a summer house, a garage, whatever it is. We're getting, I don't want to get too technical here, but there's a question about whether or not demountables are actually buildings and whether or not they're actually development in the technical sense of the word. I don't want to get into high court cases about what defines a building, but there are 3 policy tests, but they're not policy tests, they're legal tests about what is a building. And planning gets as fundamental as that, if you want to call yourself silly. So demountables, I'm a bit unsighted because I wasn't here last committee, but it begs the question whether or not they're actually buildings and whether or not they'd be captured by those removed from permitted development. I'm not answering your question very well there. I'm painfully conscious of that. But demountables could be captured by the removal of permitted development, so they could need permission in this case. It's facts and degree, depends on what's being proposed. And size, permanence and physical attachment have just come into my head. So the legal test for a building is its size, its permanence and its physical attachment. I've blinded you with
okay.
planning.
No, planning is a broad church. It is very difficult. Right, so what I'll do, I've got one more hand up and then we'll head to speaker statements and then we'll go back to questions based on those statements. Councillor Fletcher.
Thanks, Chair. Matt, just trying to get how big the deal is. If the builders decided instead of a carport house, you'd be sitting here discussing that.
Funnily enough, we've had this debate in the office. And I'm going to give a very technical answer, I'm afraid. Because it goes back to the point about whether or not a carport would be a building in the planning legal sense of the word, size, permanence, physical attachment, and partly that's an argument about, I'm going back to a conversation I had years ago with a borough solicitor at London Borough, and it's about enclosure and creation of volume. So if a carport is two supporting pillars and a roof, for example, there's a whole argument about whether or not it's a building and whether or not it encloses volume such that it is a building. Arguably, you could say, well, it's not a building. It doesn't enclose space. If it's a carport which is open only on one side, I'll take the view that it clearly encloses space. It's a building, it will be captured. But I'm going to call the question and say you've got to consider what's in front of you, which is an application for 5 new garages. So that's I'm being a bit evasive there, but because we're being a bit, theoretical.
Okay. Okay then, so moving on, we can now move on to speaker statements. Now we have three statements here this evening. There's a statement of rejection and two statements of support. Councillor Barry Johnson not here, so I'll just give you a couple of minutes to read that statement. It should be in front of you. And then we'll go to the first statement of objection. This is from a Miriam Dobson, a resident. And Miriam, would you like to Ken? Thank you, Miriam. You have.
Okay, thank you. Firstly, always highly visible. Also, from a long my view, gardens will certainly not be taking off. For some reason, garages were mentioned in the original application. Gate Farm is grade 2 and has no garage. Farm conversion style comfortably should be as proposed in setting. At this point in time, 4 of the 5 houses are under construction, which viewed from the distance do appear quite close to each other. Adding garages now will only leave the width of 1 parking space in the houses. Typical development of barn conversions often seem to park shed. Garages in another separate building similar to this barn. The original application said the site would have more separation between structures, building them now between each house to take away that opening. This is the reason that previous application citing each garage now to not increase or alter the increase. The square metre floor space of the development says increase now to include the mezzanine floor barn. Is it really possible for this area to be counted in the green belt as a different? It is ludicrous if you ask me, as every farm around is propagating their turf to demolish their many outbuildings and submit their development plan. Our cottage is immediately opposite the site, however, the farm surrounding us has in recent years been greatly extended, huge agricultural. Surely it's farmers like my neighbour that will be rushing to add those measures to each of those buildings to maximise the development potential that he owns. It's totally understandable that the argument will be that each house needs a garage, but a compromise could be siting them together in a lone barn style building with a revised plan. This would be more fitting. Going back to the original proposal, it would be replicating the more historical arrangement of farmhouse and agriculture. Please remember also that in time, it is possible that each new owner will erect 6-foot fences and apply for permission for sheds and other outbuildings, which again is an increase in the build. However, to conclude, you are going to vote on whether mezzanine floor space could be counted. If so, this would then set a precedence for other potential developers that will amount to yet another encroachment into our surviving thing. Where is this all going to end? When are you as committee members going to say enough is enough and draw a line to set an example for applications? Farmyard development is here to stay, but don't be fooled into urbanising it. Thank you.
Sometimes to read out the statement. One reason I'm saying this is I think it's have a copy.
I've got a copy.
Okay, so we have a statement of support here from Councillor Barry Johnson. I want members do 3 minutes to read that, and the members of the audience will also provide copies of that as well. Okay, so let's just give a couple of minutes. Thank you. Right, okay, hopefully everyone's had time to read that. If not, please continue to. And that then takes us on to our last statement, which is a statement of support, and that's from a James at OnePass, who's the agent. James, if you'd like to come down and sit in the corner there, and you have 3 minutes in which to present your argument. Thank you.
Evening, members. I'm going to jump around a bit. I'm going to respond to some of the issues that have been raised this evening. First of all, how did we find ourselves in this position? Why were we applying for garages later today? The reason was that we were proposing to have carports. The challenge that then created is that the council removed provisional development rights, your ability to lock your lawnmower away, store your bike, put your barbecue in the garage, subsequently evaporated because being able to put a shed in the garden. I think the case officer's done a good job this evening of setting out the test for you. So the test is, do these garages impact on the openness of the green belt? And there's 2 ways that you assess that. First of all, you've got the numerical element, which includes your hard standing, your volume, your floor space. It's been said a lot that we've maxed out on the original permission. We didn't max out on the original permission, but we didn't include a mezzanine. And it's been suggested that that mezzanine might have not existed in the first place. Well, we've submitted a building condition report. That building condition report, the main building condition report, 5 units, has photos of the mezzanine. The topographical survey of the mezzanine included. Steve McClung's been to the site, been on the mezzanine, and I've seen the mezzanine. The mezzanine was there. If you accept that position, we're not higher on volume, floor space, or hard standing. So I would say that we satisfy that test. Did you then move on to the test, which is, do we have impact on the openness of the green belt from a visual perspective? The question was raised earlier. What looks more visually appealing? Garage or a transit van parked outside, a lawnmower tied up to the side of the house? That's a decision that you need to make. If you look at the committee report, particularly paragraph 0.7, the council's landscape advisor has no objections to the scheme, so you would like to think that he's satisfied that there's no visual and impact harm. So the test really this evening is, do you think that a mezzanine existed? If so, do we exceed volume, floor space and hard standing? And I would argue not, and therefore that the application should be approved. Thank you, members.
Okay, thank you. All right, then. So based on those 3 statements, have we gathered any questions that we'd like to ask Matt before we head to the debate and vote? Any questions? No. Sorry, Councillor Foley.
But just on that. So going back to, I know we mentioned demandable, but I can remember various hospitality establishments throughout Thurrock that had temporary marquees that were there for 364 days of the year that used to be taken down for 1 day a year for cleaning and were considered temporary structures. You have the carports that you can buy from Costco's that would probably be as bigger floorprint than these garages proposed, and an array of like storage sheds, boxes. We would have no control over those. Would that be right, Matt? Because they're you can buy this garden but bench boxes, can't you? They wouldn't come. They're too small to come under community development. Like stop somebody buying a small storage.
Yeah, correct. You can't permitted allowances wouldn't stop a householder buying garden furniture, buying a storage box. You can get almost demountable little greenhouse things, can't you, with a plastic cover? It's not meant to control, because those elements are fully exempt from any planning control. They don't count as buildings, they don't count as development, planning sense of the word. So the permitted development allowances which have been removed would relate to, as I said, extensions to the buildings and permanent outbuildings, garages, summer houses, that type of stuff, which is Class E of the general permitted development order. But I suppose I'm probably not allowed to come back on anything the agent's just said, even though I'm championing it a bit. But for those sorts of paraphernalia, if you're talking about, a parasol, for example, around your patio, it's a household could do that anyway. Yeah, we're not development. We've got no control. It'd be ridiculous if the planning authority did. We'd have millions of applications to deal with. We haven't got enough people.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Lydia.
Could you tell me, in your view, how many of those garages are visible from other properties?
Oh, sorry. Well, you've got a limited number of neighbours. You've got one to the east and a couple to the north. So they'd be limited. They'd be probably the garages on the northern part of the site and the garages on the eastern part of the site would be visible. So not all of them would be visible, but again, I'd go back to the point about it's greenbelt in principle. You don't have to have additional harm. You don't have to have other receptors who would be impacted. The greenbelt is the principal receptor here, which should be permanently open.
Okay, thank you. And I just had a couple of questions that were brought up. There was a comment from Councillor Johnson that council officers were aware of the mezzanine on the basis of council officer turning out the wildlife inspection. Did they actually go ahead because of it was declared unsafe? Was you aware of that, or did you get any information from any council officers attending? Matt, thank you.
Yeah, I think I referred to that earlier. So I've got no doubt that the council's ecology officer probably did go on site and did an inspection for the purposes of protected species. Yeah. He wasn't making any beyond that. He wasn't making any planning judgment, and nor would I expect him to. He's not a chartered town planner. He's a qualified ecologist and a landscape guy. So yeah, I mean, there's been quite some debate about mezzanine, and what was there and what wasn't there and all the rest of it. I think we've said in the report, and by the applicant's own admission, it's unsafe. So whether or not it was a usable mezzanine floor, question mark. It doesn't exist anymore because the building's gone. And I'd go back to the point I made about, in terms of impact on openness of the greenbelt, you're not necessarily looking at floors within a structure. You're looking at the metrics of the external footprint, the external envelope.
Okay, thank you. And one last question, Councillor Howard, we'll start today.
Thanks, Dan. But this mezzanine issue is vexing me. Whether it's safe or unsafe, that's immaterial. It means it wasn't greenbelt. If there's a floor there, it doesn't mean if it was safe and usable or unsafe and unusable. Either way, that wasn't a patch greenbelt. It was developed land. There was something on it. So it really, if it's safe and usable, that's neither here nor there, surely. It was developed.
Within the report, we've referred to footprint. I mean, the agent just referred to floor space. I would disagree. You should look at footprint and volume, because that's the external impact of the building. The footprint it physically takes up and its external envelope by its volume, its height. You see a building, when you're looking at greenbelt openness, you see it from the outside. You're not looking at how many floors it is, whether or not it's got mezzanines in between main floor plates, etc. You're looking at the externals. So in the report on page 22, we've limited our assessment to height, footprint and volume. We haven't gone into floor space. I think floor space is a bit of a red herring.
Okay, are there any more hands up before we go to debates? All right then, so let's head to debate. I'll start in part and then sum up. I'll have a hands raised there. Let's go. Right, so first of all, I think all the arguments put forward by the resident, by the applicants, I think this is another one of those interesting planning applications that come to us, and I think it's in judgment call. I think interestingly, I think a lot of the arguments we put forward actually interesting to see what our thoughts and feelings would have been had this application come to us in its original form. And that there's the real argument, is getting rid of those barns and replacing them with 5 homes. Is that the real that can have most impact on residents in the area? But ultimately, that's been approved. Now what we're looking at is the garages. Picking up on some of the comments, I get what you're saying there, Councillor Byrne, and I'm sure you back it up. I think you're obviously making a suggestion there that, look, this is a developer, they want to add the garages, they're going to make profit out of it. I get that. For me, I don't put too much substance behind that, because I think for me, I look at it more practically. If I was to move into those homes, is that garage going to support me? And I think, yeah, it's going to make living in those homes better. And then obviously looking at the resident side of things, and hearing some really good arguments forwards, but then it does come back to ultimately what we're looking at here is the garages. We can't really take the homes into account too much, because that's not what we're discussing here. It comes down to, do those garages have that bulky impact? And with our own landscape advisor saying no, I think for me, I'm leaning towards giving this one the green light. Now, I get that fire officers would be worried if we give this one the green light, because ultimately it is going outside the bounds of what we normally do. Looking at the percentages, it is less than 9% on the footprint, massively below volume. But it'll be interesting to see what everyone else thinks. Interesting to see what you. So that's me for the moment. I'll hand over to you guys. I think almost everyone had their hand up there, so I'm just going to sort of roll away around the room. I'll start with Steve Terry. Thank you.
Thanks. This is working on it. So in the first instance, I think you know what my attitude will be to Supreme Belt, simply because that's what I present. But perhaps people aren't as familiar as they should be sitting here with what the regulation and the rules around the green belt, and they have existed for many years. In fact, getting on run. The principle behind it was to build a 25 to 35, contain a 25 to 30 mile, 35 mile green belt around London. The reason was to stop, is what London had done for the preceding 200 or 300 years through the Industrial Revolution. Spreading out. So first of all, you had sort of the movement from the city out just kept going. The reason it was put there was to stop that. Now, that was the principle behind it. If you look, the narrowest part of the green belt now is Thurrock. You have a real woeful track record of protecting it. The narrowest part is pretty much exactly where this site is, and it's 5 miles. So you still go around to Surrey and places like that, and you've got a 25 to 35 mile green strip, and you've got the odd farmhouse in it and stuff that has always been there. Occasionally there'll be a development where someone pulls down a barn. This is entirely different. This is smack bang in the middle of that 5 miles between Upminster and that's the first thing you need to remember, because now you're down to 2.5 miles each side of it. Well, you know what's happened, that's going to join up. And at that point, Thurrock is part of Great London. Now, part of the reason for the woeful record that it's got in protecting the green is because of the industrialisation along the river, and I get that. But how far north do we let that go? And it just keeps spreading further and further and further. So it's lovely for developers because effectively a greenfield site, the buildings that run it, the very old barns, no longer use. I accept all of that, and yeah, it's sensible to do something with it. Put them into houses, which lots of people do, brilliant, because it's a compromise. But unfortunately, we've lost the old buildings now. They probably be able to be preserved anyway. They first experience there as met. So when you think about visual impact, it's not about neighbours. This is about other people using the countryside. It's about about the wildlife park where people walk up the hills. And if you look down, I remember as a kid, my dad taking me to the top of Langham Hill. You could see St Paul's Cathedral, the dome of it, on a clear day. When you go up there now and look, there's development, and it's starting to look like that patchwork's filling in. So that's my principle why I'm against developing in the green belt in Thurrock in the first place. I think the point with this one is if, and Matt made the point, if you're going to build what one of our ex-colleagues used to call houses for the captains of industry, you think this stuff through. But what seems to have happened here, and it's all about footprint, as we've also made clear, an old barn in the countryside is something you expect to see. But you don't see 5 of them or 10 of them, you just see the odd 1 or 2 as a general rule. So replacing that with houses is intrusive, but I get it, I'm kind of okay, I'll swallow that. But the fact is, it was designed without garages. Now, when it's too late to alter the original application, now you want to add garages. And I'm sorry, but for me, that's something that should have been thought of. And it probably was. And the carport thing, it covers that piece of ground. The rain doesn't land on that piece of ground. So for me, I would say it's built. Everybody might have their own take on that, I'll be accepted. But I just think for a borough that has a real woeful track record in protecting the green belt, that's a very legal, as you well know, you've met with the guys that, you know, everybody has, that legally understand in depth the rules around the green belt. But I think we often, in this room, this committee, sort of choose to ignore them. I don't think we should. So that's kind of
yeah, no,
on it.
yeah, no, and it's very, very fair for you. I mean, I suppose the way I'm looking at it, I'm lucky enough. I live in one of the avenues of Grays. When I moved in a couple of years ago, I had to have a garage. It was one of the main things. It is important, and I like the fact that back in sort of 70s and 80s, we used to build council homes with garages. Which we don't do it no more due to space, but they are incredibly important. I suppose everything you said there is right. It has substance in it. I do think we're generally quite good on the planning committee. I think in the last couple of years, the only 2 claimers we've had on the green belt and Bright Marshes, I think they're the only 2 claimers, and everything else I think has been pretty reasonable. And I suppose the way I'm looking at it is, are those properties better with the garage? I think they are. And do those garages have an impact on the area? I don't think as much as what the houses do. And on that basis, I'm generally minded to support.
Okay.
I get what you're saying.
But I would argue then, if that's your opinion, then a house of that size, I would suggest they should have double garages. So
well,
that's
that's interesting.
Okay.
Well,
and actually, if you've got car parking for 4, why don't you build a big garage with 4 car parking spaces? You know, we've all seen this principle before, and the instant you just choose to sort of turn a blind eye to it, you know what's coming next. And I think anybody who doesn't see that is lacks a bit of.
I don't think it's that we don't see it, but to be in fairness to them, it's not like they're just coming here blasé with nothing. They're putting forward generally some good arguments, like the landscape advisor, like the mezzanine, and the practicality behind it. So I just don't think this is, they're not coming here blind, and for us to ignore the mezzanine is on the basis that the council are aware of it. It comes down to judgment.
Yeah, it does. And had that been the initial application, which is why I asked the question earlier, it would have been refused.
Well, respectively, had that original application come to this committee, it may have been refused. I don't know. You think it would have been? It would have been up for officer recommendation. So the bottom line is it's
definitely no way that would have
just
not a million.
discussing the garages. So
I rejected one in December, exactly the same plan, didn't we? In both.
okay, right. Let's go to the council vote.
Anyway, you mentioned bulky impact. So are we voting on bulky impact or harm to the green belt?
Sorry, say that again.
You said we're voting on it's not.
It's really, I know we're going off in solid
Not
so
bulky
basically,
impact.
we're looking at the garages. We're all really looking at the garages.
So we voting on bulky impact or harm to the green belt?
Absolutely, you're confusing me. I don't think we're voting on either. I don't think
Yeah,
we're voting on
the
either.
principle of this is that they're building garages on the green belt. You're throwing in a it's not a bulky impact.
Not against the houses, it's not already been approved,
No, just saying.
and the volume is only
Garage is not
9%
bulky.
increase, it doesn't.
Is that an argument against Greenbelt saying they're not bulky?
Look, you put for your.
Okay, right, anyway. And I was against this anyway in the agreement met, but after that statement, if you don't build garages, you're going to have transits, lawnmowers chained up against walls. This £1 million building Bolton is the guy on the last thing, we just don't have any Bolton. We're going to have a load of transits, and you said it's going to get on. Anyway, this smacks of a developer knowing he wanted to go through last time. He's cheating the system, cheating the Greenbelt, and he wants to add on Greenbelt, and he wants to add on these garages. He wants to make more money, he wants to make them more sellable, and he is taking liberties with us, thinking we're going to principal harm. We can't vote for it. Absolutely not.
Okay, thank you for your comments, Councillor Bowman. Councillor Polly.
Thank you, Chair. We've made reference in some of the addresses to the committee about cart sheds and these type of car parking spaces. In the area where I live, Church Hollow, for examples there, Dovecot Barns, we've got examples there of those type of parking arrangements. They're fully lit, they're not used for the purposes that they were intended to do. We have loose storage, which becomes fire hazards, unsightly. In fact, ones with Church Hollow, we actually have problems with vagrants. The carpet being unsafe to be used by the residents, female. So we can't go back to the original application that's been granted. I personally feel that garages would can't imagine 4 bedrooms with the amount of people that use not having storage outside. And I think if these garages, if they were the design aspects, they're in keeping with the already designed food. Just thinking long term, it would be more and less of an eyesore than eclectic mixes of short-term storage that the families will have to have with you. There will be bicycles, there will be. I can't say that it's going to be bands or not. Gary can't go, or the transit them going to but so but where I am unsettled is this reference to the mezzanine floor. Was it safe? Was it not safe? When it was at time of construction, it would have been safe. But was it deteriorated over? I think we can either prove that we have actual evidential statements to say there wasn't that building. We need to consider that as it should be about. So I'm sorry to
Okay, thank you. Councillor Ham.
Thank you, Chair. This application, I think the argument for waiting for Greenbelt is a relatively flimsy one. You're not going to up reserve area or a hill area and look out and see an unobstructed view. You are going to see homes there. Garages or no garages are not going to have an unobstructed view. So I think the argument about harm to the Greenbelt is an extraordinary. We are not talking about putting incursion into the Greenbelt of the housing estates. There are going to be dwellings there. There are going to be large properties. Therefore, the addition of garages is an incredibly minor tweak. I think this frankly does back to perhaps a lack of wisdom of passing an application and stripping it of missed development rights, because I agree with Councillor Polly, it's not unkeeping from development sites to have garages anyway. So I think as a result, we made slightly heavy leather of that. And I do question the very heavy weighting given Greenbelt. I mean, I've seen lots of applications that are quite minor that come forward with recommendations for rejection. I think it was one that we had to call a few weeks ago on the corner of North Coast and Branscombe Avenue. We recommended that for refusal without keeping the character of the area. All the houses on Branscombe Avenue and North Coast all look different from each other. So I think we've taken an argument and extrapolating it 1,000-fold about the character of the area, and I thought this is the same thing. We're taking an argument about Greenbelt and timesing it 100 times over. And frankly, building quality homes, large homes in this area, that's fine with driving and just shoehorn in other areas. And Councillor Polly's right. The resonated. The argument is neither here nor there regarding was it usable and or was it unsafe and unusable. It was there. It was there. So we're having an argument about the visual impact and debating to give that on the Greenbelt when frankly a couple of garages had 5 4-bedroom homes. It's not going to make a difference. So on that basis, Chair, I genuinely don't see any cogent reason to oppose. So I'll be in favour of approval.
Okay, thank you. Moving on, Councillor Fletcher.
Thanks, Chair. I agree very much with Steve Taylor about value to the point where I think this development I still don't, I can't get around that. But it was passed, damage is done. And, taking all the other arguments, mezzanine, non-mezzanine, all that away, we're being asked to judge whether we destroy the landscape with our standard or we destroy the damage with a 5 4-bedroom house. B, you stick a garage next to them, you're not making it. I don't think they're a good thing. Whether or not they do, I think this is the point. It's the intent. Can't see this as bad without a garage. Up 5 4-bedroom. He said, well, coverage on it. How much rain gets through tunnel?
Okay, thank you. Councillor Churchman.
I think Councillor Polly's just really summed up what I actually wanted to say as well, really, because, the house is on there. I think, the garage will make it uniform. And you do need storage if you've got large families. So, I mean, I couldn't live without my garage. I mean, I know it sounds silly, but, they're there. And I can't see where this, I think that really speaking is, you did sum it up for me. I think they took it to me there. And I invite the table.
Okay, thank you. And it takes us down to our final 2 members, Councillor Watson and Councillor.
Thanks, Chair. Probably in the same focus. I really do get what you're saying, Steve, about because if you see a lot of the stuff that's come through, actually signal against this. We are truly thinking about Greenbelt. However, that vote was passed on this one. This didn't come, as you say, before this planning committee. We're now sitting in the fact that we have got this, and to be honest, by putting a garage next to it on top of a tarmac that is already there, I think what I'd rather have than like just sporadic sheds here, demountables there, and just make it look like rack and ruin anyway. They need somewhere to put something. I've got a shed, mine's integrated though, and it is full, and it's not by the car. So I think on this one, though I wished it had come before us previously, and we probably would have said no. But it's there already, and we can't go back on it, and I'd rather have it uniformed than everything else. And Councillor, when you said about van, you know, I get what you're saying. Go down Everton Park sometimes and see the big houses down there, the vans outside, because they ain't got anything on it and they're flying. I'd rather have something, people can put things in than have a load of rubbish and everything else down the street. So on that basis, I'm going to be for this, because I think the ship is sound. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, Councillor Leon.
Seem to be over on the ground floor area, but not in terms of the volume. I know that's the ground floor area is the one we usually measure in terms of branches, green belts. I think volume is also important. I think taking into consideration what everybody else has said this evening, I need to support this application.
Okay, thank you. So that's everyone who spoke. Thank you for all your comments. Obviously, these things are slight, does come down to judgment. Really interesting to see how some feel that had it come to us originally, it might be rejected, yet now it seems to be actually practically people's not much interact with the garage. Obviously, we do get those development lists and weekly lists be sent out to everyone. So always feel free if you see something on there that you're not happy with, to pay. Get really interesting ones like we've seen today. All right then, so everyone's made comments. I think we've got a general gist of where this one might go. As always, what I like to do in this instance is I like to go to the recommendation, and we'll see if there's any appetite to review. So page 29 is the officer recommendation for refusal. Now, Councillor Byrne, would you like to propose that? You give up, yeah? Okay.
Quite interesting in principle.
Okay, thank you.
Why are we here?
Okay, so on that basis, nobody is prepared to recommend refusal. Okay, Lee, so what you'd be looking at is for an alternative recommendation, is that correct?
Yes, thank you, Chair. If it would help, sorry. Thank you, Chair. So if it would help, so just in summary, so the officer view was that the mezzanine shouldn't have been applied, shouldn't be applied retrospectively, particularly after it's been demolished. So that means that the new buildings are contrary to NPPF, contrary to policy, therefore inappropriate, which has meant there's two reasons for refusal. First one being greenbelt, second one being around the urbanising impact. There's two arguments here. The argument that I've just heard from members is, correct me if I'm wrong, Chair, but is that the mezzanine should have been taken into account, which would have meant that the development wouldn't have had a greater impact than the original building, which would have meant that it's appropriate development, not meeting very special circumstances. It's been taken by officers that it's inappropriate development and that there would need to be very special circumstances. It's quite important point for members just to agree on, because it depends on which way you go with an alternative recommendation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that, Lee. So I'd like to recommend an alternative, which is to approve these garages. Is that what that's first of all, is that seconded? Straight to Councillor Howden. Okay, so looking at the conversations that we've had, I'll obviously put this down and obviously please come in to add anything else. So first and foremost, obviously every single application is based on its and obviously we make judgment calls on this. I think first of all, in terms of impact, for me, having the landscape advisor had no further concerns on the additional impact, that substance. Okay, looking at the footprint against the volume, you're looking at a 9% increase, but the volume itself is basically below what was originally there. So I'm assuming that doesn't take into account the mezzanine. To the mezzanine, I think the basis that we had as one of the council's officers visit the site, visit the building, is proof that it did exist. Basis, I think there should be some substance added to that. And in my own personal sense, I do think that a lot of what's been said in terms of the application, we're only looking at the garages. The garages do make the development more practical. And on that basis, that's one of the reasons I'm not to give it a green light. It's on the basis of making the development better than what it already is, with having a very I do accept the arguments that have been put. So that's, I think that's everything I've got for the moment. Does anyone have anything else they wanted to add? To bring up? And Lee, did you want to come back?
Thank you. Just going back to that point around which way this splits off. So is the view of members that the development is appropriate in the green belt because the development, when you take into account the mezzanine, it doesn't have a greater impact than the original building. If that's the line that you're taking, and that's the argument that's been put forward, therefore you're arguing that it's appropriate development under the NPPF paragraph, page 14, paragraph 149G, which Matt mentioned earlier. You're saying that's the view, then there isn't a requirement to go on to acknowledge harm to the greenbelt and then with very special circumstances. If you're saying actually it is inappropriate development, the mezzanine shouldn't have been used, but we think the garages are acceptable, then needs to be a very special circumstances argument. There's two ways this goes out. It's quite important to be clear on which route we're going.
Councillor Hammond?
I think what the chair's saying is you don't need to go in the direction, basically.
Councillor Polly?
Thank you, Chair. If you could ask a clarification from Lee on this point. We're trying to protect the green belt here, and so as has been said before, decision on this application has not set in precedent. That would if we were to deem the mezzanine to be a consideration that would allow this particular to alleviate Miriam's concerns about every farmer in Thurrock then putting a mezzanine floor in their barns, that's actually the case. Would I be right?
Yeah, and that, thank you, Chair, and that's what I'm just trying to get to, because this application has less volume, more floor space than the original building if you're taking into account the mezzanine. If you're so that means that then your committee is then on this occasion giving more weight to the volume, and Matt spoke a lot about the volume, and you give more weight to the volume on this occasion. If your argument was that garages, it's okay for a developer to come back for additional garages at a later point, and that's perfectly acceptable. That opens up a whole world of pain. Yeah, and that's the important distinction here. That's why I wanted to make sure that there's a just important distinction about which way we go. So what I'm hearing from members, just replaying this. Sorry, I'm just labouring the point, but replaying that we're taking the view that taking into account the mezzanine that was in the building, that the development that's including the garages has less or no greater impact than the original buildings on site. Therefore, it's appropriate development in your and compliant with the NPPF. That's the argument. With that button down, it'd be helpful probably to look to solicitor and just for her view. The reason I asked that is because the Constitution requires the arguments to be put forward made clear in the meeting. If they are clear, then a decision can be made on tonight, and we can move on. Alternatively, it's not clear. If there's any niggles or concerns being raised by the council solicitor, then we'd have to bring it.
Hi. Don't forget there are two reasons for refusal to tackle, so the urbanising effect as well. But I follow what you're saying and agree that you've made, I think you've made it clear to members, and I think if members are clear, if it is a clear decision, then yeah, it doesn't need to go back, come back to the next committee.
Okay, so hearing Karen's advice there, so there are two reasons for refusal. The second part of what I picked up from the debate is the point that each is a matter of judgment. your view is that the garages wouldn't have an undue urbanising impact on nature of the green belt because of the development that already exists, and when measured against it, and on top of the fact that volumetrically speaking, the mezzanine that's now. So I think that's relatively clear. So all I would say is if members go to vote and it is approved, we need to make sure that conditions were imposed. This is a section 73 application, so it would represent a fresh planning application and consent being granted for the entire development. So we need to make sure that the regulations are imposed, and I don't believe it needs to be referred because of the size of the development. It's clear conditions will be changed.
Okay, thank you, and I'll see if members are happy with that. So on that basis, are you happy for us to go to the vote? So, okay, so if it's clear on that, sorry, Councillor Watson.
Chair, for you, it's down to the individual building and the original building. It's a 50-year-old farm building that has a mezzanine. Probably not much you can do, but new buildings, you typically find additions that will say no mezzanine floors. But normally because of the amount of floor space that would be within the car parking storage and traffic impact. So they can post them.
Chair, just to add to that point for clarity, for an existing building, if somebody wanted to put in a mezzanine, it wouldn't be development, wouldn't need planning permission. Doesn't affect the external appearance, it's not development. For new buildings, it's usually allowed as PD. So as the point Lee made, if it has an implication for car parking, etc., we would condition it such that it would need planning permission for new build.
Okay then, all right then, so with that, thank you for all your contributions. Let's we'll head to the vote now. So obviously I've put forward a recommendation for approval, which was seconded by Councillor Howden, and obviously we clarified all the ins and outs and conditions if voted for approval. Can you have for us to go to the votes?
Yes, Chair.
Excellent. So looking at application 22/00101/CV, Bosgate Farm, all those in favour of approval, please raise your hands. And all those against? And abstentions? So you're happy with that, Kenny? Abstentions?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so that was yeah, 2 abstentions, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, well, so it's 5 votes in favour, 1 against, 2 abstentions, and we can say those farm has been approved. Okay, thank you. So what we'll do now is we'll move on. Councillor Thurrock. Yeah, a quick bathroom break. Say a couple of minutes, and then we'll start with the last application on the item, which is Tilbury Green Power. So that's item 8, Tilbury Green Power. And Matthew, if you so kind to present your report. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Me again. It's a short presentation for a fairly long report, considering what it is. So that's the site. It's the Tilbury Green Power energy plant, which is stone's throw away, the other side of Grace Beach. So it's an operational biomass fueled power station, and it has consent for a second phase, which hasn't been implemented yet, which could be either combustion of fuel pellets from waste, or the consent actually allows processing of waste on site and then combustion of waste, but that's a further down the track. The application has been made to the Secretary of State for Business, Enterprise and Industrial Strategy, so not to the council. It's not a council decision for you tonight. We've been asked to provide consultation comments on a proposal to increase the electrical output of the consented power plant. So the current application it's for 80 megawatts. Originally, back in the day, it was 60 megawatts, but it's gone to 80 already through various changes. Can we? I think there's another couple of slides. Yeah, so that's just Google Maps. Doesn't really tell you a lot, but there are two sort of grey buildings on the right-hand side. Left-hand side there, close to the river, close to Grove Beach. That is the existing power plant, and then to the right of it, where you've got Thurrock Green Power, there's a lot of vacant land. That's the remainder of the development, which will eventually be built out once they get basically a market for the feedstock. So currently, it's consented to 80 megawatts, and the applicant is asking the Secretary of State to change it to 88 megawatts. The only that's essentially the only change. It's relying on technological improvements, fuel efficiencies, getting more power for the same feedstock. So basically, there are conditions which we have to enforce, even though it's the Secretary of State decision. We have to enforce the conditions. We get the that end of the stick, which limit the amount of stuff going in. So that's in terms of tonnages per year, how it comes in, etc. That doesn't change. So none of the air quality assumptions change, none of the noise assumptions change, none of the transport assumptions change. It's more efficient kit, putting it simply, which gets more power out of the feedstock. So it goes from 80 megawatts to 88. That is the only change. What I should have said, and completely out of my head, we've had a late letter from the Environmental Health Officer. Very short and sweet, no objection, because it's as a result of new technology. There would be no implications on air quality and operational noise. And the other thing, which obviously members might be interested in, is HGVs trundling up and down the 1089, and then the A13, and then junction 30. Again, no change. It's no change beyond what's already been assessed and approved by the Secretary of State, because it was the Secretary of State's decision, it wasn't ours. We've probably brought this before you a couple of times before, because various things have been tweaked over time. But this one is relatively straightforward. More power for the same inputs, no additional impacts. And what we're suggesting, I don't think Jenna has any, Kenna, there's any, yeah, that's just the snapshot of it. So increase in power, it's a consultation response to the Secretary of State. No impacts, traffic, emissions, noise, air quality. For a change, it's fairly straightforward. So the suggested consultation response from this local planning authority to the Secretary of State, which I'll try and get off fairly soon, if you agree the recommendation, is basically as on page, get there in a minute, 51, paragraph 8.1, no objection. Happy to take questions.
Wonderful, right, let's, I'll tell you what, I will open it as protocol. Any questions? Oh, excellent. Let's go to, let's just go in that order, shall we? Steve Taylor.
Thanks, Chair. So effectively, the giveaway, I think, was in the letter you just read. What they've done is they've got a 10% efficiency increase based on technology. That assumption is what was suggested, I think.
Yeah,
which is pretty important.
Yeah, there's a bit of context and a bit of background within the report. In fact, the mechanism for changing these consents. I mean, what I would say is nowadays the power proposal is more than 50 megawatts. It's not our decision; it's the Secretary of State decision under an NSIP, and that's why recently you've had solar farms, Fen Lane and whatever, and they badged as 49 megawatts, and there was a reason, because they want to take a decision through the local planning authority, which is quicker, basically, quite considerably quicker. So this one originally was 60 megawatts, but it was before the NSIP legislation took effect, so it's a bit complicated. So it's an old Electricity Act, 1989. I know it. I recall it. Recited in my sleep, unfortunately, section 36.
Yeah.
And the Dean Planning Commission, and the mechanism for changing that consent actually says that because these projects take a long time from inception to actually getting power out technology inevitably changes and there will be improvements in efficiency. This is a good news story. It's the same inputs for more power, less emissions, less reliance on fossil fuels. You know, it is a good news story, especially in the current climate with reliance on imported supplies from certain parts of the world. So that's the point. The technology is better. You can get more power out of the same inputs. Simple as that.
That's great. Thanks, Matt.
Fantastic. I just cancel that.
Matt, that's a great story, but is a megawatt that not loads or I don't know if it's impressive or not. I don't know what a megawatt is. Is that like lighting up a village or a town? Or
It works like most things. You go from watts to kilowatts.
So it's a lot.
To megawatts. So the big megawatts is a stair chunk.
Oh,
Yeah,
good.
11 kV is the biggest you see in our little substations that you're connecting on housing estate. They're 11 kilovolts.
Oh,
Right, so scale of what that's putting out is kind of
For sort of reference, a traditional thermal power stations, a gas or coal, they would be 700, 800, 900 megawatts. So of an order bigger, but a wind turbine, the four wind turbines at Port Tilbury are 3 megawatts each, 4 megawatts each. Yeah, I think I'm trying to remember the solar farm because this question comes up when we deal with solar farms, and you ask a question on how many households is that. So I think like a 49 megawatt solar farm would be
6,000.
It's several thousand, isn't it? It might even be up to 10,000. So yeah, this is into the 10. It's into 5 figures in terms of households comfortably.
very impressive. Yeah, brilliant.
so to increase it by 10% is even more.
Nice. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, over to you, Councillor Polly.
I'd just like to thank Matt because I think that was pretty impressive to be put on the spot like that. That was a lot of megawatt brain power being used there, Matt. And again, backing up what the chair said earlier, you know, we are supporting people. Just really, Matt, is this plant the only plant that we know in the UK using this technology? Are we leaving it?
No. No, I don't think so. There'll be a number of biomass plants. I mean, there aren't. I mean, there's one in Bristol, and I think there's one in Manchester. I've been referred to in the past. So there will be several, but the technology is always changing. Always getting more efficient.
Sorry, it just come back. I wasn't asking if we're the only biomass when we were working on that. But it's been referred to new technology increasing output. Just wondered if it was the technology if we're the first power station. Sorry, I think.
I suppose potentially, yeah. I mean, what I should have said in the introduction, and I don't. I'm not that good. Is that the phase 1 is operational, and that's putting out. It's in the report 40 something megawatts. So it's the phase 2, which hasn't been built yet. It's that empty bit of space, which is a different feedstock. It's going to be potentially fuel pellets, I think, where that technology has moved on. I mean, theoretically, at the time when it's built, and touch wood, it would be built, that will be it could conceivably be the first in the country. I'm not going to say it'd be the first in Europe, but it will be the very best at that time, because obviously it's that's what the developer wants. They want more power, more for their investment, because there's the contracts with National Grid. So it's financially makes financial sense for them.
Okay, and Councillor Churchman.
Just a quick one, Matthew. The second phase is basically is what you were saying about the phase, waste to energy.
Yeah, the consent is probably set out in the report, but it's a while ago since I wrote it and it's gone out of my head. So the consent back in 2009, I think it was, allowed biomass and energy from waste. Now, that has if you just take the term energy from waste, that can have certain connotations, you know.
I know you said that.
But what the consent allows for, it does allow them to import waste and process, but it also allows them for the waste to be processed somewhere else, and you get fuel pellets of a certain calorific value. My most recent conversation with the developer, which would have been, it wouldn't have been this year, it would have been sometime last year, is they were more looking towards the fuel pellet thing. So you wouldn't, and even if they were processing waste on site, there's a load of planning conditions about odour and all the rest of it to control it. And of course, it's worth mentioning, it's not just planning control. That sort of operation is subject to a permit from the Environment Agency about emissions and all the rest of it. So there's a high level of control about these sorts of operations.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. And just a couple of questions I had. So does that mean they'll be using the plant more, any more noise, or just generally everything within reason? No further impact on noise or anything?
No, that I can't say, but what I can say is there are conditions on the planning permission to control emissions. So the nearest noise sensitive receptor, and there are residential properties to the north on the other side of Groves Beach. I can't remember the name of the road. Curzon Drive?
Yeah.
Where did I remember that from?
Yeah.
So there will be conditions which operate now and in the future about about noise levels of those boundaries. So yeah, we're covered on that.
And I assume the same with sort of glass zones and things like that, more energy being pumped out. I assume that's covered by similar conditions, yeah?
Yeah, it doesn't count as a hazardous use in point of fact. I mean, in point of fact, it used to be the sweetener plant, didn't it, Cargill's, which fun enough there was a coma, hazardous substance consent there. But this operation, even though it's creating electricity and burning material, it's not a hazardous use in itself, like some of the hazardous uses we've got at, you know, London Gateway or Petroplus or the former Petroplus worker. So that's not an issue here.
Okay. Excellent, thank you. I've got no further questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just, this obviously has come back through the government department because it's been granted 80 kilowatt, 80 megawatts. Just future reference. Obviously, if we've had some that have come through asking just megawatts, that can be we can approve that locally. Could they? Do we have to be wary that once we've approved something that's under 50 megawatts, that could set precedent so that they could then go to national government and say, actually, we want to do 85 megawatts there. It's already been granted 50, so what's the problem? In principle. Or I'm saying, do we need to be wary in future that somehow, if there is someone that's coming forward for a 50 megawatt or something, we try and, is there any way we can put conditions on that it can't increase above the 50?
I think it's more fundamental than that. It's a completely different consenting regime for 50 megawatts up. I mean, there's a separate act. It's a separate planning act. It's the 2008 Planning Act, which set up something called the Infrastructure Planning Commission, which was then removed and goes back to Planning Inspectorate. So it is a completely separate regime. So in that scenario, we grant permission for 49 megawatts, and then they turn around and say to government, we want to do something more. I think central government would basically say, that's very nice. You have to put in an application for something called a development consent order, and that's going to probably take you thick into 2 years, and you're going to go through an examination, and they're going to be inspector appointed, and they'll probably go back to ground zero and consider it in terms of it's an application for 80 megawatts as opposed to 50 plus whatever. Is that the point, or am I going off beam here?
No, you are to a point, but what I'm saying is that developers, I don't think it is as naive as that. I'm suggesting that they may actually build 49 megawatt plant, operate it for 2 or 3 years, knowing that in future they're actually looking for an increase. So once they've already got it up and running or building it, then perhaps it doesn't matter to them if it takes 2 or 3 years to go through the government. The fact is they can use the principle of that initial development to argue the case to make it bigger. But I say it's not. This isn't necessarily the time and place for the discussion, but it's something that I'd like to know the answer on.
Yeah, I mean, we are aware of that, and funnily enough, on the next agenda, it's likely you'll get an application for an energy-related project, and it's one where we, you know, I don't want to say too much because it's not on the agenda yet, and it's not for consideration, but it's something we have to be wary of sites nearby and the cumulative generation. Let's put it that way. But again, I don't want to say too much because that's for another day. We are alive to the issue, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Right then, so with that, we do have a recommendation, 8.0 on page 51. Would anyone like to recommend judgment? Seconded by Councillor Lydiard. All those in favour of the Tilbury Green Power Station's increase in power, raise your hands. Okay, so that is unanimous. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the meeting. Remember, we do have a meeting on the 21st of April, which is not too far away. And keep an eye out for that email for the site visit. I don't know if it'll come to fruition. I suppose it's quite complex because I suppose if 5 of us turn up, turn up and go, well, site visit, and I suppose we'll have to stay in favour of it. So we'll keep an eye on that. Is there any thoughts on that? Do a site visit for coming to us? Oh, sorry, Councillor Watson. We had a request from an applicant who's proposing a solar farm on the 21st of April. They said, oh, you know, the site visit we can do. Nothing's been agreed. I wasn't sure it was just the throw out as we just break the plan and then we could site visit. Just
I'm always in favour of just that as a result of asking us advance on site visit, the rigmarole of starting an item, having a site visit, because when you come back to the next meeting, we've got plenty of items on that agenda anyway. We spent 1 hour in one meeting, going on to the next meeting. So if there was no, we tapped on the shoulder and just said, like a site visit, or are you minded to want site visit? It just kind of keeps the agenda signed to a single meeting. Yeah, so yeah, just personal preference. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Just wondering, but, and that is the way that's
Yeah, I mean, it's the first time that the request has ever come up, so really it's just testing it because it's interesting for some of you to know. But
personally, I mean, I'm not sure what. So, I mean, I'll often.
I might throw a date out there potentially. I might. So it has to be.
Yeah, I can't remember which application months ago. And I think we held it over the next meeting where we did some of the people and we did go to the site visit. Where there was we didn't all go. Talk amongst ourselves. And I can't see any problems if they're prepared to hold a meeting. And enough councillors want to go along on the planning committee to see what's on. At least it gives us an insight, sometimes perspective of what you actually see on site is a lot different sometimes what you see on plans. So I don't think it would be a bad thing. That's what the thing.
Okay, all right. So just keep an eye on your emails and there's no pressure to go. Brilliant. Right, well, thank you everyone. That is the ending of the meeting, and I'll see you, if not on that site visit, in a couple of weeks' time on the 21st. Brilliant. Thank you very much. And I understand, do we need